I'd like to get to our program. We have a special guest, Julissa Arce. She's part of the exhibit that is in the other room. She was nice enough to meet with me in Los Angeles and be interviewed, so we appreciate that. And she was here this morning and had a nice conversation with a bunch of fifth graders who were 100 of them who were very well behaved and had some wonderful questions. Julissa's first book in 2016 was titled My Underground American Dream. The book told the fascinating and heart-wrenching, but in the end uplifting story of how she persevered from the stress of finding herself an undocumented immigrant as a young girl to becoming the VP at one of the most powerful financial firms in the world, pretty much by sheer force of will and amazingly hard work. And more importantly, it also told how that hardship drove her to do more than just take her success and financial reward for herself, as she became an activist and voice for so many people dealing with those same issues. Most recently, Julissa's second book is a young adult version of this story entitled Someone Like Me, which is what the fifth graders today were so excited to not only hear about, but to receive a copy of. And we're fortunate to have a chance to hear more about Julissa's story and talk to her about the writing and how her life drove her to writing. So please help me in welcoming Julissa Arce. So I was going to start off and just ask you a few questions before we go to Q&A. Your book is very different from maybe some of the stereotypes that we might expect of a book of someone who has come to America and is undocumented and is dealing with those issues. You came from a very comfortable living in Mexico. Your parents were legal immigrants in the United States doing business. And can you tell us or explain what brought you here and what created the situation that made you an undocumented child in the U.S.?
Well, thank you for coming out. I know it's really cold outside, and I've got to be honest. Every time I do an event, no matter what, I always sit in the little room, just afraid that I'm going to come out here and there's going to be like 2 people here. So, so thank you so much for coming out. It means a lot, especially in this weather. So to answer your question, you know, I did have what I think a lot of people would consider a very comfortable life, a very middle-class life. I went to private school in Mexico. I had ballet lessons, and I went to art classes, and I didn't really have to worry about shoes on my feet or food on my table. But I think that one of the things that I realized as I was older was that the reason I could have that life in Mexico is because of the sacrifices that my parents were making here in the US, right? And the reason I had that comfortable life in Mexico, to me, the biggest price that I was paying for that life was the absence of my parents, because I lived in Mexico and my parents lived in the US most of the time. They, as you mentioned, they had visas that allowed them to travel back and forth between Mexico and the U.S. So they would come visit us and stay with us for a few weeks, and then come back to Mexico and be gone 4 months at a time. So, so I think that's the first thing that I would say, because you know, when I think about the motivation for my parents wanting to come to the US, it really was always to give us a better life in Mexico, right? And because they felt like with the opportunities they had there, I wouldn't have been able to go to a private school and have all the things that I had. I came to the US when I was 11, and how many people here have read the book? Okay, so there's a few of you. So you've read the story, and for those of you that have not read the book, I hope that you'll pick it up, because there's a lot of really great things in there, really great writing. But I might give some things away. And one of those things is like the reason, when I think about if I could point to one choice I made in my life that was really the impetus for my parents bringing me to the United States, although I think it would have happened anyways at some point. But I gave this boy that I had a crush on, I was 10 years old, and I gave this boy that I had a crush on a Playboy magazine. That, yeah, I know, scandalous. That I found this magazine, and I just thought he would think I was cool. I mean, I was 10 years old. I had really no idea what I was really doing. And it was a big scandal. I mean, my grandma prayed like 10 rosaries that night for my soul. My mom and my dad like immediately went back to Mexico. My sisters who were in a faraway town in school, I came back. We had a family meeting. It was a big thing. And I was 10 and not really understanding like what was the big deal. And, you know, everything passed. My parents came back to the U.S. and I thought that was the end of it. I was like, I'm not even grounded. Like, what's happening? And then I came to visit my parents for the summer, and then I stayed. And they eventually told me that I was going to stay in the United States because they didn't think that me being in Mexico by myself pretty much at this point, living with my grandmother, was the best thing for a 10-year-old girl, especially because of the way that, quote unquote, I was behaving. And so that is what brought me to the United States. And then, as those of you have read in the book, there was a series of really unforeseeable circumstances that led to my parents having a very different economic situation than they did when I first came to live here. So 3 years after I moved here, my visa expired. And, you know, in fact, 40% of the undocumented people in the country never crossed the border illegally. We came here on some sort of visa, whether it was a tourist visa, as I did, a work visa, a student visa, and then that visa expired. And for many reasons, people are unable to renew them. As was my case. And that's when I became undocumented. I was 14 years old. I had been in the US for 3 years. I had finally started to learn English, and I had finally started to make friends. And I had finally started getting to the idea that now I had parents. Because for 8 years of my life, I thought I had parents, but my relationship with them was so different when they would come visit me, rather than them being in my life, being a constant presence in my life, really parenting. And I didn't really understand what it meant to be undocumented when I was 14. I mean, I was just upset that I couldn't go to Mexico to have my quinceañera. That's really all I wanted, was to go have a party in Mexico with all of my family. I mean, just my family would have been like, you know, 100 people guest list. And that's all I wanted. And my mom said, you can't go because your visa has expired. And if you go to Mexico, you won't be able to come back anymore. And those were the circumstances under which I became undocumented.
So that in the book, and obviously in life, that became something that was a huge part of your day-to-day life for another 15 years. And can you talk a little bit about how heavy, you know, as you said in the beginning, it doesn't affect you, but eventually you're trying to go to college, you're filling out applications. Can you talk about how that stress then builds and builds over the course of years as you're trying to live your best possible life and be successful and really be a part of the world that you're living in?
Yeah. So there's a lot of consequences to being undocumented. I mean, the very first one for me was this this fear that overcame me all the time, because the biggest thing was not to tell anyone that I was undocumented, because if people knew, they might use it against me. You know, I've been very motivated and very inspired by young undocumented people now who are out fighting for their rights, and they are, you know, chanting, "We're unafraid, undocumented and unafraid." And I think to myself, when I was 15 years old, 16, 18 years old, I did not have that power to say those things. And so I was very much afraid, and I was very much keeping the secret from everyone. I shared earlier with the students that when I was 16 and it was all of my friends were getting their driver's licenses, I always had to lie about why I didn't do certain things, right? Like when they said, "When are you going to get your driver's license?" I would just say, "Well, I don't really know how to drive yet." And then they would say, "We saw you drive the other day." And I'm like, "Oh, well, yeah, but you know, I'm not ready yet for the test." When in later on in college, when my friends were applying for study abroad programs, and they would say, why don't you go? And I very much wanted to go. And I remember many times going into the study abroad office to find out information about what study abroad programs there were and how I might be able to qualify for them, very well knowing that I was kind of being delusional in a way because I knew that I couldn't go. And so it really, I think for me, the biggest things about being undocumented were the everyday small things that we, and I say we now because I am a citizen now, I do have papers now, that we take for granted, right? Going to a bar to get a drink with a friend and not having an ID. So, college students, I don't know how many of you here in college had a fake ID. I think a lot of us probably did, right? I see some college students being like, I have one now. And, nobody, we all kind of are like, yeah, that's like a thing we do. We have a fake ID when we're in college to go get a drink. But for me, the idea of like getting caught using a fake ID to go get a drink was just something I couldn't even fathom because the consequences for me could be much greater, right?
And, in that same vein, because it's something that so many young undocumented students have to deal with every year, can you talk a little bit about what it meant for you in higher education as far as, applications, financial aid, what you had to go through to just try and be a student?
Yeah. So in 2001, Texas became the first state in the U.S. to allow undocumented students to go to college, pay in-state tuition, and receive state financial aid. And I know that's like really hard to believe today, but Texas was leading the way for undocumented students' rights, which is really amazing and also really sad how much things have changed. And that was in 2001 when this law passed. And as I talk about in the book, finding out that this law had passed and that now I could apply to go to college was, it was really life-changing. It really, really changed my life to be able to apply to college, to receive financial aid, state financial aid, and to be able to go to college. Today, there are really only 23, 24 states that have similar laws that allow undocumented students to go to college and pay in-state tuition. And then you have places like Georgia, Alabama, and South Carolina where they have laws that make it a crime for an undocumented students to enroll in certain universities. So if an undocumented student tries to enroll in, let's say, University of Georgia, they could be charged with a crime. So, in some places we've made progress, and in other places, in my opinion, we're going backwards. And that continues to be a really big challenge for every year. There's about 100,000 undocumented students that graduate high school that still cannot access any kind of financial aid. And because of that, I actually started a scholarship fund in New York, and in 6 years that we've been around, we've awarded almost $500,000 to about 60 students so that they can go to college, because I don't think that your immigration status should stop you from attending an institution of higher learning.
And you mentioned they gave you state aid and they gave you in-state tuition, but in most states, $5,000 doesn't cover in-state tuition, right. And it didn't cover it for you. No. So you had to work, you had to...
Oh yeah, I sold funnel cakes in San Antonio, so I would take a Greyhound bus and then go to San Antonio, sell funnel cakes, and then on Sunday nights I would take the Greyhound bus and go back to Austin. I did apply for one scholarship that didn't ask for a social security number, and I don't think they meant to be open to undocumented students because, 20 years ago, people couldn't really even imagine that undocumented people went to college. And so I got this scholarship, and actually Rick Perry, the then governor of Texas, awarded me this scholarship and shook my hand and gave me this big plaque that said that I was the shining ray of hope for the future of Texas. I still have that. It's actually in my living room because I really I really took that to heart. I was like, I am the future of Texas.
In your book, you talk obviously a lot about you had a huge amount of drive to get to your job, to get through college, to get to Goldman Sachs in particular. But before I ask you about Goldman Sachs, I'm kind of curious too. You have a unique background also in the fact that you had, two women business leaders in your family. Your grandmother and your mother were really both very strong businesswomen who were very successful. And I'm kind of curious how you saw that then and how you see it, in years later. I mean, obviously it was just what you knew when you were a kid. Yeah. But how did it impact you?
Yeah, I mean, I've always had really great examples of strong women in my life. My mom, she only went to 6th grade. And after 6th grade, she had to drop out of school because she had to be home to help her mom take care of her younger siblings. And my mom, with a 6th grade education, was still able to, at one point in her life, she was importing the business that my parents had was importing sterling silver jewelry from Mexico to the U.S. And actually, they would go. There's a big convention center in the Chicago area, right? I forget what it's called.
McCormick Place.
Maybe it was something Rose.
Oh, Rosemont.
Yes,
Yeah,
Rosemont.
yes.
So my mom would go to trade shows there, and I'm always just so impressed with the fact that my mom was able to accomplish that. I don't want to give too much away, but there was a lot of things that happened, and eventually the business went bankrupt. She could never recover from thefts that happened in the United States, not on the dangerous Mexican side. And my grandma too, my grandma my family has always been one of matriarchs, and they always really encouraged me to be who I wanted to be. And I have to say, it wasn't just my mom and my grandma and the women in my life. My dad also had a lot to do with me always growing up feeling like I could do whatever I wanted to do, because my dad always taught me all the things that in my culture might be viewed as something that you teach a son. My dad taught me how to drive, and when he taught me how to drive, he said, you're gonna know how to change a wheel in the car, and you're gonna know how to change the oil in your car, and so he always really also empowered me, and never made me feel like, oh, you're a girl, you have to do these things, ever.
And you had some mentors at Goldman Sachs too, who were a woman who was helpful to your career and was a good example. So, but I'm kind of curious that drive you had for Goldman Sachs. Can you talk about not just that you had it and obviously you did a ton of work to get there and to succeed, but what made that want so strong in you?
I wanted to make a lot of money. Was really the number one reason I wanted to go work on Wall Street. I saw this poster in college that said you can make $10,000 working on Wall Street for the summer, and I thought, oh my God, $10,000, that's gonna solve all of my problems. Like I'm gonna be able to get a green card, and if I'm rich, then like who's gonna wanna deport me? I'm gonna be rich. This is like 19-year-old me thinking these things. And, the reality is that it didn't matter how well I did in my career or how much money I had, because the laws didn't allow me to apply to get a green card. I didn't qualify. I think when we tell undocumented people, why don't you apply, we're forgetting the very real fact that the laws as they are in the United States today do not allow the majority of undocumented people to apply. I was one of those people for 15 years, which is why for 15 years I was undocumented. But that really was my motivation. I just thought, I need to make a lot of money, because if I do that, if I'm powerful and if I have money and if I have status, then I'll be able to solve my immigration issue. And that wasn't the case. And that was one of the most frustrating things in my life, was feeling like I had done everything we tell people to do. Learn how to speak English, even though, I think that that's already in and of itself has a lot of connotations to it because, by the way, like learning another language is really hard. And it's not that immigrants don't want to learn English, but sometimes there are no resources to learn English. But I did it, learned English, you know, got a college degree, got a great job, paid taxes because undocumented people pay taxes. I mean, I did everything and still wasn't enough. It just always felt like the goal line was always moving, constantly moving.
And you mentioned, you describe it a little bit, I think the phrase in your book is, you know, as a golden cage. That you were in this situation and nothing was changing as far as where you were, and all of the different things that got in your way.
By the way, the golden cage, la jaula de oro, I didn't invent that. Like Los Tigres del Norte invented that phrase, and so I got to give them credit for that because I did not come up with that on my own.
Well, it's a good phrase. And but the so you know, and you've mentioned a lot of these different things that were your impediments, and yet you were extremely successful. You left of your own accord, though. Can you talk a little bit about, you know, what was that thing that happened, or you know, that kind of made you say, I need to do something else? So.
As I mentioned, when I was little, I mean, first of all, I didn't know what Wall Street was. But when I was little, I never was dreaming, I'm going to go work on Wall Street. That was never like my dream. And then I did feel very much like I was trapped in that job because I didn't have the flexibility to leave that job and go try to find another job while I was undocumented, right? I never really had the freedom to really ask myself, what do I want to do with my life? And that's, I think, a very big luxury, to have that luxury, to be able to ask yourself, what do I really want to do with my life? You know, my mom never asked herself that question. Her drive in life was to give her children a better life. And whatever that meant, that's what it meant. And for the first time in my life, when I decided to leave Wall Street, I had a green card. I had the financial resources. At that time, I still had a husband that could dance. You know, I was like, I can finally ask myself, what do I want to do with my life? And I had that freedom, and I had never had that feeling in my life. And so I decided that I needed to leave and I needed to figure out what I wanted to do. And what I realized was that I had always wanted to be a writer. I had always wanted to write. And I had a really important story to tell, which was my story, my truth. And I thought, especially with everything that was going on at that time, this is like 2016 when I'm deciding to write my first book. I think you guys remember what happened in 2016. And I thought, you know, I really need to share my story. I can't keep holding on to this. I have to share it and give people a glimpse of what it's like to be undocumented. One story of what it's like to be undocumented, because to your point, there are many stories.
You mentioned about feeling like you wanted to be a writer for a long time. And when we met the first time, you told me about what really started you writing, which goes back to being young and your journals. Can you tell everybody about that and how important that was?
Yeah, I mean, journaling was like godsend to me because it was the only place where I could really be honest about what was happening in my life. Because as I mentioned, part of being undocumented is having to tell a lot of little lies to everybody about why you do certain things, about why you act a certain way. And then it really comes to a point where I would think, why did I tell them I couldn't go? You know, because keeping a lie is really hard. Like, you have to remember what lie you told to whom. And keeping track of that, it just becomes impossible. That's why the truth is always so much easier. But in my journals, I could be really honest with myself. And I could really express how I was feeling and why I was feeling those things. And I remember shortly after my dad passed away, writing in my journal, one day all of this shit is gonna be for something. All of this pain has to amount to something. One day I'm gonna write a book, and I wrote out all of the chapters of the books I was one day I was going to write. And that was about 10 years before I actually wrote my book.
And back on this notion of language that you brought up, you were 11 when you came here. You didn't speak really any English. I think you said maybe a song you could sing. You very quickly learned the language. And you mentioned in your book the first time you dreamed in English. I'm curious, where are you now as far as language goes? Do you have a dominant language? And how does it affect you as a writer?
Yeah, I remember the first time, I dreamt in English, I was really freaked out. I woke up and I just was like, oh my God, I'm gonna watch Univision all day today because I was like, I'm gonna forget Spanish. And I was really, really freaked out, especially because like people that didn't even live in the United States, like my family in Mexico was like speaking English, and I was like, this is really freaky. So I think over time, English has definitely become my dominant language. I mostly speak in English. I definitely write in English. But more recently, I have made a really concerted effort to read more books in Spanish. I'm remarried and my husband speaks Spanish, and so we speak Spanish to each other. But language is a really interesting thing. We have with us a great storyteller, Nestor Gomez, with us today. And if you haven't heard his moth story, you must listen to it. And we were talking about this today, that part of what he describes in his story, and I hope it's okay if I say, it's this idea that as you're learning English, you are in some ways losing connection to your culture, to your family. Because there's been points in my life when there's certain things that I feel like I cannot describe to my mother anymore because I don't have the language to describe those things to her. And I found myself not calling my mom as often, not talking to my mom as often because I felt frustrated by my own inability to communicate with her. And I don't want that to be the case anymore. And so that's why I have really try to take big steps to, and I've always considered, and I have always been fluent in Spanish, but I stopped learning Spanish when I was in 5th grade, right? And so my vocabulary wasn't growing as I was growing. But language it's a really tricky thing. But now I'm really, really, really comfortable with speaking Spanglish. Like I really am. Like I don't mind it at all. In fact, in the latest book proposal that I've been working on, I didn't even italize any of the Spanish words because I find myself when I'm reading any book, right, that there are words that I don't know what they mean because I think we're constantly always learning language, right? And so I pull out a dictionary and I look up what the word means. And so I thought, people can do that too. If there's like a Spanish word they don't know what it means, and hopefully you get the context, right, because it's in a sentence and you can figure out what it means. But if it doesn't, there's our friend Google.
That's a good point. So the first book was obviously your story written to a more general, older audience. And now the new book that just came out last year is that story told for a young adult audience. So can you talk a little bit about the why you decided to do that, but also the process that goes into that? How do you write to a different level if you've already written the story, and how do you change the story?
Yeah. I loved writing my young adult book, and I love talking to children. They are so amazing, and they blow my mind with the questions that they ask. It's incredible. And also I'm like, oh my God, when I have a kid, they're gonna have so much competition. I need to get them started day one, I'm gonna start reading to you. But I wanted to write a young adult book specifically because when I was growing up, going to 6th grade, living in Texas, where there's a large Mexican population and a large Mexican-American population in schools, still, I never read a book that had a Latina protagonist. And especially, I never read a book about an undocumented girl, ever. And that made me feel really lonely because I just didn't think my story was important because nobody was telling the story. And so I thought, if I can make a difference in like one child's life because they read this book and something in my story resonates with them and they're able to connect with it, then they can know that their stories are so important that people are writing books about them. And that really was why I wanted to write for young adults. I think I was, at the beginning, I was a little bit afraid that the things I was writing, middle grade students would not understand, right? Like, how do I write the scene about I gave this kid a Playboy magazine? Like, no school is ever gonna wanna give this book to their child. How do I write about my dad having a problem with alcohol? How do I write about so many things like that are really difficult things to write about? I mean, even for an adult audience, it's difficult to write, and so for a young adult, it's even, to me, it felt really daunting. But part of what I did was read a lot of other young adult books to kind of try to get a sense for what the tone should be like, for what, and then I kind of talked myself off the ledge because I thought, kids are a lot smarter than we think they are, and they know so much more than we even want to admit that we know they know. And so then I kind of really just started writing. And in the book, in Someone Like Me, the first half of the book, it's all new. So it's stuff that is not in my underground American dream. And I really enjoyed writing about living in Mexico and growing up in Mexico and what my life was like in Mexico, because I had a life before I came to live here, and I really wanted to share what that life was like.
Well, I'm going to change topics now. I'm going to ask you, before we go to Q&A, to talk about your book is, as you've said, it's you telling your story, the original story, because you felt like there were people that needed to hear it. This version for kids that would really resonate with some children that need to hear it and connect with someone. There's a book that just came out, and I'm going to guess that a lot of you know about this book, but in case you don't, the book's called American Dirt. And there's some issues with it in the sense of who wrote it, what it's about, how the characters are portrayed, and you mentioned this morning that you're in the midst of writing an article for one of the media outlets about it, and that you had to pick it up in the airport to read it so that you could write about it. So I'm just kind of curious if you've read any of it so far, and where you are with the issue and with the book itself.
Okay, so I want to... So one, I had read excerpts of the book and an advanced copy and had skimmed through it. So it's not, so when I was commenting on it before, it's not like I was commenting on it without having read the book or knowing what the book was about, or like at least having an idea of what the arc of the story was. I have since, as you mentioned, because I felt like, okay, now I'm going to write about it, and I really need to be able to like say, yes, I read every word, I underlined, I like really carefully read through it, right? So that's what I'm doing now. Like, and yes, I'm almost done. Okay, where do I start? Let me give you an example. I talked about my quinceañera, right? And how I like really wanted to have a quinceañera. Who here has been to a quinceañera? Okay, who here has had a quinceañera? Okay, a few of you. But most everyone here knows what a quinceañera is. Right? Okay. It's this really important, well, to me it was really important party to have. And in the book, the book starts off with, there are 16 people at this quinceañera. That's like red flag number one. I'm like, 16 people at a quinceañera? Like, are you kidding me? That's not even like, that's like... Yeah, that's like breakfast, not even dinner. I was like, red flag number one. Then, I'm not giving anything away from the book in case you are gonna read it. then the cartel shows up and they kill 16 people. And after the cartel leaves, 101.FM is on. So you're telling me that at a quinceañera, the music is coming from the radio? Like, at the very least, you would have a playlist, you know, like premium Spotify, like no ads. Like, are you kidding me? So just from, I know I'm not just trying to be like funny. Like, these are the type of cultural inaccuracies that from the beginning, I felt like this book is not really giving, it's not really connecting with the cultural experience that it's trying to represent. And, you know, people should make up their own mind about what they think about the book, but what I will say is that everyone should really listen to the people that are telling you that there's a problem with this book. Because we're telling you that because it's trying to represent in many ways our experience. And not one experience is going to be the experience, right? Like, my book doesn't tell every undocumented person's life or experience. No book is going to do that. But I do think that as writers, we have a responsibility to be accurate about the things that we're trying to write about. And I also think that there's a bigger problem with what's happening right now, which is that, you know, the book is very much being marketed as the book if you want to learn about undocumented people, the book that is going to change your mind about what's happening at the border, the book that it's going to change you. I mean, that's like actually on the jacket of the book. This book will change you. And I just think that there are so many people, and I know the author has said that she wishes someone slightly browner than her would have written this book. And I think to myself, there have been a lot of brown people, including me, that have written about the subject. And to say that is to invalidate the work that we have done. And, you know, it's not entirely her fault. Like, a lot of people had to, it takes a lot of people for a book to come. I mean, you guys, there's seriously like 1 million people involved in getting a book to the shelves, right? There's like your editor and the publisher and the publicist and the book buyers and the booksellers, and I mean, there's so many people, right? So this to me was just like a perfect storm of everybody buying into this narrative, and you know, now we have, and to be honest, like, there was a point during the last week where all of this has been happening where I felt a little bit defeated. I just felt like there's nothing I can say or do. Like, this book is gonna sell so many copies, and it's going to be in classrooms, and it's going to be, people are gonna think that they know about immigrants because they've read this book. And I mean, you know, it's happening, but I feel a personal responsibility to keep talking about what the issues are with it, and also elevate the writers and the books that, to me, feel more authentic to my experience. And I think, you know, if there's one good thing from all of this is that people are also talking about what are the alternatives to this book. If you don't want to read this book, if you want to read more authentic experiences, read this other books.
Yes. And
read my book, Someone Like Me, My Underground American Dream. Read Erika Sanchez's book, I'm Not Your Perfect Mexican Daughter. We have an amazing author in the audience. Please, thank you for being here, Erika. Yeah, read our books. I highly recommend them.
And read any of the books of any of the authors in the
Yes.
exhibit in the other room. And if you check, a lot of them also talk about their favorite authors and things like that. So take some time in there. I appreciate you answering my questions. I thought I would open it up for people who want to ask questions. Anyone have a question they'd like to ask?
How do you get over crying when you're telling your story? Well, first, thank you so much for picking up my book and for and for that really kind note. I still cry, to be honest with you. there are times when I talk about my dad passing away and not being able to go to Mexico to see him because I didn't have papers and I never seen him alive again. Like right now I can tell you because I don't feel as emotional about it today, like in this moment. But there are times when I'm saying that, I cry. And I think that as women, we're told so many times, don't cry because that makes you look less professional. Don't be emotional because blah, 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 blah. And to be honest, like I think that we need to push back against that because when men cry, they're being so vulnerable and we give them so much credit for it. So I do think that there is I get your point about obviously you want to get through your story without crying, right? And being able to say it. And I think a lot of that is just going to come from practice. Like practice, write your story. A lot of people just want to like get up. But even when I do public speaking, if it's the first time I'm telling a particular story, I actually write it out and I read it and I practice it. So do that, like write your story. Whatever is the story that you want to tell, write it, get in front of a mirror and practice it. And if you can get to the point where you don't cry in front of the mirror, then, tell it to a few friends. Then get a bigger audience and just practice. And know that it's okay to cry at some points in that story because it's an emotional story and it's your story. And I think it also gives permission to the people you're telling it to feel like they too can be emotional about their story. Hope that helps.
Another question?
By the way, when we were here with fifth graders, every hand was up. So I'm just saying.
Yeah, you guys got a lot of ways to go.
Yeah. Thanks for asking that. And yeah, I definitely felt very much like a culture shock when I went to go work at Goldman. I was very fortunate that I had sort of mentors that really talked to me about what it was going to be like. And right, to be honest, like right now I'm sort of like struggling with before. So if you would have met me before, right, I would have said I was sort of like a big proponent of like, let's have like dress for success workshops so you know what to wear, and let's have etiquette workshops so we know what fork to pick up. And more recently, I've been thinking how the undertone of some of those things are very racist, to be honest. And so, but I also understand that when you're in those jobs, unfortunately, you're still inside that system, and it's very difficult to be like, well, I can speak for myself. It would have been really difficult for me to be like, F all of you guys, I'm gonna show up with my hoops, I'm gonna put on my red lipstick, I'm gonna, like, it's very difficult to do that. But I think that even taking, like, for me was like taking small steps to still be able to be myself, so that when it was all said and done, I didn't feel like there was nothing left. Because I think that's sort of a little bit how I did feel when I was deciding to leave. I felt like I have no idea who I am anymore because I've had to change so many things about myself to fit in here. And now, when it's gone, I don't really know what about this is actually true about myself. And so I have spent the last 4 or 5 years in this new career really trying to figure that out. Like what about these things are really true to myself? And, the other part of what you were talking about, which is taking opportunities far away from home. And, I think that as Latinos, we feel such a big responsibility to our parents and to our family and to our community. And sometimes I think we also have to break out of that a little bit. I've done that. Obviously, I had a different experience because my parents left when I was 18. They moved back to Mexico. And so since I was 18, I've kind of been on my own in the United States. And I've not really experienced that feeling of, oh, I need to stay in this one place. I lived in Texas. I lived in New York for 10 years. I lived in Los Angeles for 5 years now. If I had to move to Chicago, even with y'all's cold, I would be like, I got to move to Chicago. So I haven't experienced. But I miss my mom all the time. There are times when I think I should move back to Mexico. My mom's getting older, but she also doesn't. She hasn't put that pressure on me either. To be like, you have to be here. And so if there is a job you really, really want and it's somewhere else, try it. Because what's the worst that can happen? You have to come back. You come back. And if you have the ability to do that, then take a risk. And if you have to come back, so be it. By the way, I'm giving you this advice with not knowing anything else about what you're saying. So this is like a very big blanket statement. Take from it what resonates. Yeah, only what resonates. Everything else, yeah. How do you translate the finance into writing a book? I'm like, write me a bigger check, please. No, I think, it is sort of different. In some ways, I do think it's sort of a different skill set, right? Being able to like crunch numbers and do models and whatever else I was doing before. But the other part about finance or studying finance and being in that kind of Wall Street corporate environment, I do feel like it made me really disciplined. And so that's the part that I think really helps me as a writer, is to be very disciplined in how I write. And I don't know that I would have learned certain things had I not been in that particular environment. So that's really what I take. But in terms of just like the writing, I don't really know that. I went to, in undergrad, I was in business school, right? It was business school undergrad. And I don't think that business schools do a very good job of teaching students how to write. Like the longest paper I ever had to write when I was in undergrad was 18 pages. That was the longest paper I ever had to write before I started writing professionally. So I've had a steep learning curve as a writer. And I continue to become, I hope, a better writer the more that I write. It's just like anything else. The more that you do something, the better you get at it. And now I'm amazed at how much I can write. Like before writing 500 words, I'd be like, oh my God, I have to write 500 words. And now when I have like a 1,500 word limit, I'm like, I only get 1,500 words to say what I want to say. Like, give me 3,000. But yeah, I think the discipline is what I can say mostly I've took from finance to what I do now.
Would you also say in that role, you had to talk to a lot of clients, you had to sell people, so it wasn't just number crunching. You were really pushing products and services and talking to clients, so there was a lot of communication.
Yes, I have always loved to talk. That is correct. It's funny you should ask that because I had stopped journaling because I thought I was busy, because if I had a random thought in my mind, I could just tweet it out. And I realized a few months ago that it had been a long time since I had spent time with myself and written for myself. Not because I wanted to write something that anybody was gonna read, just for me. So I actually picked up a journal, and I've been journaling again now for like 4 months, and it's again become a daily practice. And I realize now doing it again how much I really missed it, just writing for myself. Yeah. No, listen, I definitely thought about that a lot. I thought, oh my God, I'm sharing so many embarrassing things about my life that I have never told anybody ever. And I sometimes would just like go like this when I was writing, like, oh, okay, I'm really gonna say this. And then for me, the biggest thing was sharing stories about my dad. And one of my sisters was really upset with me because she felt like I was dishonoring my dad's memory by sharing these things about him, and also because that wasn't the experience she had with my dad, because she lived in Mexico and I lived here, and so I saw the worst of it, right? And I I sort of just had to say to myself, for me, if I'm going to write this book, I have to be able to be really honest about what I'm writing. Because if I hold back, if I'm not vulnerable in my writing, you are going to be able to tell that. And it's not going to feel, you're not going to be able to connect to it as much as you would. At the same time, there's still a ton of things that I didn't include in the book that they're mine, right? Like those are things that are for me, that are mine, that I don't want to share. And so you kind of have to determine what those things are for you, and talk. I mean, my ex-husband in the book, that's not his real name, and I talked to him about, hey, I'm going to write this book, and I have to write about our relationship, because that's how I became a citizen, and so I had to talk to him about it, and like we had a conversation about what he was okay with me sharing and not, and so I also had to respect that. But you brought up a really good point. I mean, you can always write a novel that is very much inspired by your experiences, but then you can make things up, right? You can like let your imagination be free. That's what I'm doing now. I'm like working on a million things, but one of the things that I'm working on is a short story, to somewhat inspired by an experience I had that I don't really want to share fully, and so therefore I'm gonna tell a fictional story. But the other thing, you're saying you're sharing your story in like your activism and in speeches, and so those are like incredible ways to share your story. Not if you want to write a book, you 100% should write a book. But I think also there is this, sometimes I think we feel like unless we write a book, we're not really sharing our story, right? Unless we don't share everything, then we're not really sharing our story. And I think it's important to also keep things that you need to keep to yourself. I'm full of terrible advice today. Sorry. So you guys didn't know that you guys were coming here for a political fundraiser? No, I'm just kidding. No, I'd kid. I get that question a lot, and sometimes the question essentially is would I run for public office? And I get that question often, and sometimes I think it's very flattering, and then other times I think like, oh my God, you think I would be a politician? The really short answer is no. I really don't have any plans for that. I will do everything in my power this year to do whatever I can to have a different result, because I never want to feel how I felt in 2016. It was a god-awful feeling, and but I think that the way that I want to make a difference is through my writing and through my activism. Yeah, but thank you for asking. Yeah. I used fake papers. Yeah. And so sometimes I talk about it. Today I just didn't even think about it. But yeah, so I bought a fake green card and a fake social, and I don't really know how they work. People always like want to really know how they work, and I don't know. I didn't pay a lot of money for them because I didn't have a lot of money to pay for them, but somehow they worked. I mean, I went through background check, and then obviously every time that I got a different license, right, like I had to go through background checks from FINRA and the SEC and the Commodities Exchange because I had all these licenses. And that, I'm so glad you asked, because that, every time I had to do that was fucking terrifying. Every time, every day. I talk about in the book how I used to have this recurring dream where my boss called me into her office, and in my dream, I knew what that meant. And in my dream, that meant like I was caught, right? Like I didn't see anything else. I didn't see like ICE agents and like all this. No, it was just her calling me into her office, and I knew in my dream what that would mean. Yeah, but so I don't know how they work, but that's how I did it. And I know that that's, sometimes I lose people when I say that. But I just felt like that was like my choice. I had no other choices. I either didn't work, or I try to work. And I will say this, I think one of the biggest reasons that nobody ever found out, well, obviously now everybody knows, right? But when I was working there, that people didn't know, is because of our own stereotypical mindset, that we would never imagine that an undocumented person would be working on Wall Street, working at Goldman Sachs, right? And I kind of was hiding in plain sight, if you will. I didn't know that when I was going through it. I wish I would have really known that, because I was afraid all the time. But I think that that's the biggest reason why. And, you know, I gotta hand it to Lloyd Blankfein, who was the CEO of Goldman at the time. When my story first came out, they asked him for a comment, and having worked at Goldman Sachs for so long, we were always told to tell the media, no comment. So my best case scenario was that Goldman would give an official no comment. But instead, Lloyd Blankfein, his comment was, wouldn't it be great if we were able to give people, we were able to give young people an opportunity who want to come to our country and give their talents to make our country and our economy better. And I was floored. I was like, oh, I cannot believe he said that. So, yeah. Why did we take one more question? Just kidding. That is a very, very difficult question. And, you know, I think that so here's the thing about being undocumented. Every day, you know, you're conscious of the fact that it could all go away. But also, at least for me, I didn't always think of the worst case scenario. I always thought of the best case scenario. Right? What is the best thing that can happen if I do this? So instead of being driven by fear, I've tried in my life to be driven by hope. And I know that sounds really cheesy, and like it could be, you know, a t-shirt. Maybe I should make a t-shirt. But that really is my message today to people who are still undocumented, because it is very uncertain, right? Like for people that don't know what's happening, just very, very quickly, DACA, which was the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, that's just one example of many things that are happening. It was a program that gave you a 2-year work permit and protected you from deportation. That's it. It wasn't a path to citizenship. It wasn't amnesty. I wish it would have been, but it wasn't. And people, you know, would apply, and every 2 years you would renew, and then the current administration ended the program. And there's been a lot of court cases to try to stop the administration from ending the program. It has gone all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court at some point between now and June will tell us what it is that they've decided to do. And there's a number of different scenarios, there's different things that can happen and different ways that it could go. But there is one of those scenarios, being the worst one, right, that the program ends, and people who currently are protected, when their DACA ends, they will not be able to reapply, and they will not be able to work. And a lot of them have now, you know, there's DACA recipients now that are working everywhere, from being teachers. Some of them, you know, have GEDs. Some of them are working on Wall Street, and everything in between. But they're doing it. They have been doing it with the assurance that, like, you know, it's a legal way to do it. Like, they have a work permit, they can do it, and all of that can go away. And that's really bad scenario. But you know what can also happen? In November, we can have like a different person that can change things, that can, you know, we could maybe potentially actually have like real immigration reform, not just for the dreamers, but for their parents, who are, to me, like the original dreamers. And so my message is just keep going. Do what you can today. Like, prepare for what could be the best possible scenario. If you're in college, don't think to yourself, well, I'm gonna just drop out because I might not even be able to get a job. Like, no, stay in college, do the best that you can, because guess what? The best thing that can happen is you graduate with honors and you get like whatever job you want. You know, if you're in high school and you think I might not be able to go to college, you never know what can happen. And hopefully the best thing happens. Just keep going.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, everybody,
you.
for coming out. It was really wonderful.